What's up, film fans? One of my favorite genres of film is the scuzzy, kind of low-rent crime film from the 1970s. There are a lot of great crime films in Hollywood and in other films' histories, going back to the Musketeers of Pig Alley in 1912 or even earlier maybe. But there's something about the crime films from the 70s. First of all, they tend to have crackerjack scripts. There was a sense back then that good screenwriters could work in this kind of scuzzy area. So the scripts tend to develop really well, spend time on different characters' lives. There's a sense that they're really well developed without feeling sort of overly deterministic or too tightly plotted. The plots work, but they also breathe. Also, back in the 70s, there was still this sense that character actors could play important roles. So you have a lot of different faces, a lot of different character types, body types, and that works really well in the kind of crime films that they were making back then that were set in small towns in the Southwest or Northern California or in Florida or wherever else it might be, where you might come across people of all walks of life. So we didn't have to have like every single character is beautiful, except for the obviously flawed, where they might have a little bit less than Hollywood mainstream beauty. So the films look kind of real. And that's especially true of the 1973 film Charley Varrick, the subject of this episode of What Makes This Film Great. Charley Varrick is a 1973 film. It was directed by Don Siegel. Now, probably some of you have heard of him. He's quite well known for the films he made with Clint Eastwood, particularly Dirty Harry, which was the film he made immediately before Charley Varrick. And in a lot of ways, Charley Varrick was conceived by Siegel as his follow-up, and it was meant to be just as big or bigger than Dirty Harry. It wasn't. It's a great film. In some ways, it's kind of, I think, more interesting than Dirty Harry because it's not so dominated by one personality, although its central performance by Walter Matthau is fantastic, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The script was written by Don Reiser and Howard Rodman, based on the novel The Looters by John Reese, and the script underwent quite a few changes. When Siegel began working on the film, it was conceived of as a rated R film. It was going to have a lot more sort of sex, some twisted sort of criminal sexuality, a lot harder language. But Universal Pictures, who were putting the film out, came across a deal that they would be able to show some films at Radio City Music Hall around Easter of 1973. And they chose Charley Varrick as one of those films. And once that decision was made, the sexual content, the language, the violence had to be toned down for a PG rating. And that changed the casting of the film too. Charley Varrick was originally going to be played by Donald Sutherland, who at the time was not necessarily an unknown, but a lesser known star. He wasn't the star that he would come to be. The casting of Matthau brought a kind of box office veneer or box office sheen, or what was meant to be a box office sheen to the film. So there are hints in it of some kind of, I wouldn't say there are hints of twisted sexuality, but there are hints of a sort of darker story in the film. And I think probably part of what makes it work so well is that there are only those hints. Part of what's so great about the world of Charley Varrick is that it feels lived in without everything having to be explained. So there are scenes that take place in this brothel in the desert, for example, and it's not set up. We don't get the backstory of the madam. We don't know how it was built. We don't see how the women who work there are treated necessarily. It's there, it's part of the world, and the film moves on. So it does this in a lot of ways, including in some of the sexual relationships that do take place in the film, but mostly off camera. Reese, the novelist, had a lot in common with Elmore Leonard. So if you like Elmore Leonard novels and films like Jackie Brown or Get Shorty, Charley Varrick has that vibe to it, that sense that, These are people on the margins. You get this a lot in Elmore Leonard's books that are just kind of existing just outside the law. They might still have a foot or just a toe in straight society like Charley Varrick, the character, does. But they're also straddling that margin between sort of straight society and criminality. And it's the step too far into the criminal world that starts the machinations of the plot of films like this. And that's what starts the machinations of the plot of Charley Varrick. And I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to say a little bit more about the casting of the film. So, like I said, the film stars Walter Matthau as Charley Varrick, and this is a really interesting casting decision, if you ask me. Charley Varrick is a man who's kind of lived on the fringes of society. We don't get a lot of his backstory, but we do learn that he was kind of a barnstorming circus pilot, you know, flying those biplanes and doing tricks and so on. And now he's become a crop duster, and as he says, there's not a lot of money in crop dusting these days. So he's become a petty bank robber, a small-time bank robber. And he, again, doesn't talk a lot about it, but the one or two times he does, he makes it clear that he's robbing small regional banks for small amounts of money to stay under the radar. And that's all he really wants to do. And Matthau often plays, I mean, his shtick is to be a crotchety guy. You see this at films around the time, like A New Leaf, or a couple years later, Bad News Bears, and of course, The Odd Couple, which is probably his most enduring role. You know, he's always got this kind of like, I'm a grumpy guy kind of thing going on. And he actually underplays that a little bit in Charley Varrick. He plays this almost straight. And part of that is because he's always in motion. From the beginning of the film, as things start to go awry, he's got to be on the move. And he blows up a couple times at people in his sort of vicinity. But for the most part, he's just trying to get things done. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because this is how the film, you know, moves along and keeps you invested, is that it's one thing and then the next thing and the next thing. And Walter Matthau, just has to keep going from one stage to the next if he's going to survive the movie. But what's really great about the film, I mean, Matthau's great in it, but what's really great is that it features a cast of just beautiful, normal 70s people. And if you've watched a lot of 70s films, you'll recognize them. And I just want to show you some of these faces so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. There's Matthau as Charley Varrick. Jo Don Baker plays Molly, and Molly's kind of the hitman heavy who's put on Charley Varrick's trail near the beginning of the film. Then you get somebody like John Vernon, and if you've watched any films from the 70s, you'll recognize Vernon as the bank president who's aware that this crime has gone on and who starts to slowly realize that he's in over his head. You get Woodrow Parfrey. This guy has an amazing 70s face, and he shows up all over the place in the 70s in films like Stay Hungry, Outlaw Josie Wales, and here he's the president of the bank that's actually robbed in the opening scene, and becomes kind of a sad and tragic end. You get Benson Fong as the head of the Chinese mafia, which has an important role to play in the film. Norman Fell, Mr. Roper, shows up as the sort of FBI guy who comes in to investigate this crime. And there's also Andy Robinson as Charlie's partner Harmon, who a lot of people would have recognized at the time as having played the Scorpio killer in the previous year's Dirty Harry. I think in Charley Varrick, his character, he's still a little bit over the top, but he's not so crazy intense as he is in Dirty Harry. These are all just wonderful faces that I have a hard time believing you'd see in films today, or see all in the same film. You know, you might get one appearance of a John C. Reilly, who's a fantastic actor. He's got a great kind of 70s face, but that might be it, whereas Charley Varrick is populated entirely by these people. Even the women in the film, who come across as sort of 70s beautiful and glamorous, they have this kind of wounded look to them. You know, these are women who are also a foot in the criminal world. Some of them are prostitutes at the brothel. You get this photographer who also is a forgery expert. And they come across as kind of beautiful and glamorous, but also sort of not picture perfect like they might today. So you get Cherie North, for example, as the photographer who's, trying to play every angle in the situation that's going on. She looks great, but she also just her attitude is, I don't have time for any of you guys. And her look conveys that. And you get Jacqueline Scott as Nadine, a very important early role in the film that I'll come back to. And Christina Hart as Jenna. She doesn't have a big role in the film, but she plays one of the prostitutes at the brothel that Molly really insults, and you can feel that she's if she had her wherewithal, she would take this guy down. She's another face that shows up throughout the 70s. So as you're watching the film, before we even get into the story, you get the sense that everybody in the film is driven somewhat by desperation. So, what's the film about? It's a very simple crime film in a lot of ways, but because, as I said at the top, the scripting is so good in this film, it becomes complex in ways that you don't always notice until you've watched the whole thing. Charlie, as I said, is a crop duster. He runs a small business with his wife Nadine, who he met back in his pilot circus days, and they have decided together to become bank robbers. And they've brought in a small crew, including Harmon, and the film opens, the opening credits sort of set the scene of this idyllic town with wonderful music by the composer Lalo Schifrin, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then Charlie in disguise and Nadine pull in, and they pull up in front of the bank. And if you're watching this film and you know who Walter Matthau is, you know right away that's a man in disguise. And maybe even if you don't know who Walter Matthau is, you can tell this is somebody wearing sort of makeup and a wig and all this sort of stuff. And the film announces its twists and surprise quite early as Charlie goes into the bank, Nadine's parked outside, and the bank robbery starts to go down like this.
I'm sorry, sir, but it's an out-of-state bank.
Oh, but that's a bank cashier's check, sir. What could possibly be wrong with that?
I'm sure it's fine. I'll just have my secretary check on it.
Sure.
Miss Vesta?
Yes, Mr. Young.
Would you mind getting on the phone verifying that?
That's a perfectly good...
Against the wall!
No, mother, move!
Keep your hands up.
Okay, open that vault. Nobody will get hurt.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God.
So what's great about that scene is we haven't seen those colleagues of Charlie and Nadine. This is really the opening of the film. And so we know something's going to be going on. We know this is a guy in disguise. Before he goes into the bank, they meet the police outside. The police tell them, you can't park here. He's like, I'm old. I got this cast on my leg. Just let me park. I just got to cash this check. And he goes in. The police are like, it's okay. And so he goes in, and then this robbery happens, and all of a sudden these two customers turn out to be on his team. It makes total sense once you realize that this plan was already put in place before we encountered it in the opening of the film. And this is going to happen again and again throughout the film, that when these twists occur, first you go, oh wow, but then you're like, yeah, it makes sense. And they're not the kind of twists that are meant to sort of shock you or surprise you, because they always make sense. But the film's letting you know early, be prepared for surprises, because they're going to keep coming. And so they rob this bank, and two things go wrong. First of all, the cops who first come up to them when they're parked outside, Charlie and Nadine, they think it's a little bit of a weird interaction, so they want to check the license plate. And so as the bank robbery is going on, we get this tense sort of Hitchcockian suspense where we know the bank robbery is going on inside. The police don't know that yet, but they're waiting for this license plate to get called in. And so we have an expectation that once that license plate comes through, there's going to be something wrong with it. And that's the case. The cops get the dispatch call that it's the license plate from a stolen car that's a different car from the one it's on now. So they call this in and the police come back. And what ends up happening is a shootout. One of the partners who's in the bank, who's mostly unnamed in the film, gets shot, but Nadine gets shot also. She's sitting out in the car to be the getaway driver, and she gets shot as well. I'll come back to that in just a minute. The other thing that goes wrong, that seems to go right at first, is that while they're robbing the bank, Charley and Harmon come across a huge pile of cash, an unexpected pile of cash. And this is what really kicks off the story, because of course the police are going to try to figure out who robbed the bank, but the people who own that money really want to figure out who robbed the bank. And that's what's going to drive the film. You have the cops looking for Charley. They don't know it's Charley yet. The feds get called in. They're looking for him. But also a conglomeration of official and unofficial people, basically the bank president and the mafia, are also looking for Charley because they want that money back. So this is what I meant earlier when I said once the film kicks off, Charley's just got to be doing one thing, another thing, and another thing. Because not only is he trying to stay away from police capture, he's trying to survive a mafia hit. And that's going to compel him to make the decisions that he makes throughout the rest of the film. But let's return to Nadine for a moment, because the film does something that, again, feels very kind of 70s to me in its brutality and in its necessity. You get this a lot in 70s movies where characters are put up against the wall and they have to make ugly decisions, and the films let them make these ugly decisions. So we see that there's been a plan in place all along. Harmon and Charley, with Nadine bleeding from this gunshot wound, drive up to the woods where there's a Charley Varrick crop dusting van waiting for them. And they've got disguises and they've got a way to hide the money. And the plan has always been to torch the car. They've got a bunch of gunpowder and they're going to light it on fire, get rid of fingerprints, get rid of everything. But once they get there, the realization sets in that Nadine's not going to make it.
She's finished. You know that, don't you? Listen, Charley, you're going to screw around and some shopper's going to come and throw a net over us.
Charley?
Yeah.
And this is where the film makes, I think, what it's its first big kind of twist and its first kind of brutal 70s moment when they decide to torch Nadine along with it. And at this point, the film hasn't informed us yet how much money they got away with and where that money comes from. So we're not paying attention to the mobster storyline yet. We're just paying attention to, are Charley and Harmon and Nadine gonna get away from the cops, right? We're early. We're only 10 minutes into the film or so at this point. So we're probably thinking, yeah, they are. And then they torch Nadine with the car. And what we also don't know at this point is that Nadine, she's not just one of the crew. She's Charley's wife. And they came up together through the ranks of the sort of barnstorming circus career. They started the crop dusting company together. He takes her wedding ring off and he's going to wear it through the rest of the film. And he never has a moment throughout the film of kind of heartbreak or where he breaks down and cries. But slowly, as we find out what she meant to him, it adds a lot of unspoken weight to Charley's decisions throughout the rest of the film. And it's one of the things I love about it. There's one moment in the film, which actually happens a few minutes later, when Harmon's trying to sort of talk to Charley about Nadine and, you know, how great she was, where we get a little bit of exposition, and Charley's like, well, we met in the circus and I did this and she did that, and then we started this company and then we met you. And it feels a little bit awkward because I think Harmon would already know this stuff, but it just takes a couple minutes, and it happens as they're driving away from the explosion, and we get the first sort of relief from all the tension. So they get this little conversation. But throughout the rest of the film, there is almost zero exposition. We find out almost nothing about why the money was in that bank. You know, it hints here and there, but nobody sits down and says, hey, this is the racket we're doing, and this is how we're laundering money, and blah, blah, blah. It's just, you know that there's criminality going on here based on the way the pursuers start to come after Charley. And it's one of the things I love about the film is that it takes your intelligence for granted. It doesn't feel the need to sort of spoon feed you with backstory and plot, which, funnily enough, that was one of the things Walter Matthau didn't really like about the film. He's like, we need to explain what's happening here. I don't even know what's happening here. And maybe for an early 70s film, that kind of big exposition drop throughout would have been more normal coming out of the 60s. But I think today, with today's eyes and the way we sort of understand how story unfolds in film, there's never a moment in Charley Varrick when you're confused about what's going on. It's not, oh, wait, who? What? Who's that? Yeah. It all totally makes sense and unfolds in ways that totally make sense. So, you know, don't worry about that. But back to Nadine, this decision to torture in the car, I just think it's just so brutal and at the same time so well done, because as you learn Charley's relationship with her, you get the sense of urgency. Like, he only would have done that if ... And so you start to realize that even before we know where the money came from, Charley knows, and he understands that what he's doing has to be done or it's his own neck. We get an understanding of this best in this scene with Harmon, and they get back to Charley's trailer where he lives in this sort of little desert trailer park. This all takes place in New Mexico. And Harmon is this kind of typical dummy criminal. You know, he's muscle, and he just wants to blow this money, as he says.
I've been waiting all my life to make a score like this. And now that it's here, I ain't waiting no more. I mean, I'm gonna wail. And I'm talking about chicks, cars, clothes, a box at the races, and beefsteak 3 times a day, and no washed up chicken shit. Son of a bitch, you'd better try stop me.
That's all he cares about. Chicks and booze and food and clothes and fun. But Charley knows. And you get the sense that as he explains things to Harmon in this scene, he already knew what he was dealing with back in the scene when they decided to torch the car with Nadine in it. Here's how Charley explains things to Harmon.
So maybe that little bank was a drop, a collection point. Maybe all this was on its way out of the country.
Fantastic. We lucked out.
More like crapped out. It's 10 to 1. This stuff belongs to the mafia. This is gambling money, skimmed off the top. Whore money, dope money.
What's the difference?
The difference is that the mafia kills you. No trial, no judge. They never stop looking for you, not till you're dead. I'd rather have 10 FBI's after me. Mafia money. All I wanted was a small take, in and out, quick, no big deal.
Charley's realization here is that it almost doesn't matter at this point what he does with the money, right? If he spends it all on clothes and chicks and booze, if he saves it for 3 years, as he suggests, or if he returns it to the people he stole it from, the mafia is going to kill him. The mafia is going to kill them both, no matter what they do. So what the film becomes about, and what's really exciting about it, is Charley's efforts to forestall mafia murder. Not so much the money. The money is always important. I mean, they want their money back, and Charley and Harmon would like to keep the money, but staying alive is what becomes important, and that's what drives his decision making. And that decision making leads him to a bunch of other sort of marginalized, unsavory characters. And With each of these people he meets, there's a guy in a pawn shop who he goes to find out about fake passports. There's the photographer who can forge the passports. There's a guy in there's a guy in an ammunition shop where he gets dynamite from. And all of these people, Charley knows will turn on him in a dime, and most of them do. So not only is he aware that he has to stay one step ahead of the mafia and the hitman they've put on his trail, but he also has to work with these other marginally criminal people to make sure that when they turn on him, he's got a cushion of time or geographical space that will protect him from that. So all the decisions he makes are operating on several different levels at once. And you don't always know that when you're watching the film. You see him go, hey, I need this thing, I need a passport, I need dynamite, and so on. And, you know, it just seems like that's what he's looking for. But he's also calculating how long is it going to take until Molly gets here? How long is it going to take for him to, get the answer from this person? And how long is it going to take for him to find me after he gets the answer from this person? And we don't see him talk about that. We don't see him, think that calculation out. It becomes apparent that he's always got this in mind. And this is what I meant at the top of the video when I said that it's got this crackerjack script. Because every decision he makes, even when it's not telegraphed to us, even when it's not sort of projected straight into our face, makes sense after the fact as we go like, what's he, yeah. And it's exciting when you feel like you're in the hands, like this is just this little dumb little crime film, but you're in the hands of these professionals who are telling you a story that works on every level. One of the things that works really well in the film, but might come across as a little dated to modern viewers, is the score by Lalo Schifrin. And Schifrin was one of the great composers, is an Argentine composer from the 60s, 70s, 80s. He's still around today. And the music in this film is fantastic because at times it has that very early 70s crime scene sort of stuff going on. It has this sort of quasi-jazz. He wrote the Mission Impossible theme, so he's got that off-time signature thing going on. But also there's a meta element to it. Look at this scene. You see, we've got this kind of groovy music going on, and then there's this transition as the action changes on screen. The music changes with it. That's what I'd call metadiegetic. Metadiegetic. Maybe I should do a video on diegetic music or diegetic sound in music and different types of diegetic music in film. Would you like that? Let me know in the comments. I think I'll do a video about that. Anyhow, the music does this throughout. I mentioned the opening credits, and I'm not going to show it because it's kind of long, but the music in the opening credits is great because before Charley rolls into town to rob the bank with Nadine, we get these snapshots of the different people in the town. The kids, the families going about their business, sort of post-hippie young adults in love and all this stuff. As we transition from one of these groups to another, the music changes subtly in a similar way to what I just showed you in this sort of metadiegetic fashion. And in that way, the music's almost not just supporting the action, it's kind of commenting on the action. That's another fun thing about the film. There's also this great little meta moment.
That's what I call a hell of a lock.
I'm Molly.
Yeah, I didn't figure for Clint Eastwood.
It's small, but I think it's funny. So it's one of those films where things are operating together. The performances, the direction, the script, the music, cinematography is great. You get all these awesome desert scapes and the sky looks fantastic. And it's a really well-made film. And at the time, it was critically received very positively, and it's still well thought of. There's a lot of filmmakers who talk about how much they love this film. But for some reason, it didn't do well with audiences, and I think its popularity never recovered. So it's the kind of film where if you talk to other fans of 70s movies, they'll say, oh yeah, Charley Varrick, I love it. But a lot of casual movie fans who know that the 70s featured this kind of crime film don't really know much about this. And it's really worth tracking down because it's dirty, it's gritty, it's well made. When the film ends, you feel like, yes, that did everything I wanted it to do and more that I wasn't even expecting. The performances, from the smallest bit parts, the old lady in the trailer park, to Matthau himself, to Joe Don Baker, is just so menacing and nasty throughout. I mean, he knocks a guy in a wheelchair right over just to do it. He's a horrible person and he's great at it.
If you want to know what I know, get some cash on the counter.
It all works together to make this just super tight, beautiful, ugly little crackerjack film. Although, if you're into crime films, if you like things a little gritty, if you like to look at like a script that just performs above and beyond your expectations, and if you want to see Walter Matthau play a character that I think is a little bit against type, then Charley Varrick is a film you really have to check out. It's an example of what 70s crime films do best. It's a lot of fun. It's a little bit sexy. It makes you feel a little bit, but in a way that you want to feel when you're watching this kind of movie. And I highly recommend it. It's really worth checking out. That's all for now, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. As usual, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button, and I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe. I'm slowly inching my subscriber numbers up there. I'd like to get them a little bit higher before the new year, so share this video with other friends of yours who love movies, and share my channel, talk it up. A lot of you say really nice things in the comments, and I appreciate it a bunch about how much you've gotten out of this channel. So, I love it when you say you share it with all your friends. That's fantastic. Keep doing it. I look forward to seeing you. I'm going to do another video about gritty 70s crime film coming up really soon, so watch out for that. But in the meantime, my name's Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.